So now that you've seen how objects can work together and one can have an object as an attribute, or they don't have to be related, but there's still an association, or it can be a really strong relationship that if one object dies, the other object dies because they're both functionally dependent upon each other. Let's see another way that objects can work together. Let's say that you have an object of type student, and that student has a course. So there's a course object inside of the student class. And then the course has a object of type final exam. Now, the student doesn't really have to have a course, and the student object can exist without having a course. But when it comes to the course and the final exam, every course has to have a final exam. So that's a strong composition relationship. So the final exam object will be an attribute in the course object, and the course object will be an attribute in the student object. Now the problem you have is when you have this relationship and you end up making a student object and then stored a course object in the student object and stored a final exam object in the course object, if you ever wanted the final exam to be able to access the student object, in Python there really isn't a great way to get to that. So what you can do is actually pass the student object as a parameter to the final exam object. So you store that student object as a value or as an instance variable within the final exam. You can also store the course object as an instance variable within the final exam. Now that the final exam actually has a reference to the student object and the course object, it can actually access those methods and attributes for those other objects. And all you have to do is pass those other objects as a parameter and then store it in an instance variable. Let's look at an example, and I think it will make more sense as to why we want to do this. So let's go ahead and create a brand new program. And let's save that file as student register.py. And in this program, the first thing I want to do is I want to create a student class. So we'll create the student class. And then one thing in this student class, let's say that every student object that gets created, we want them all to be the same university. So what I can do is I can actually create a class variable called university name, called CP University or CPU for short. And every object I create of type student will belong to CP University. They share this. Remember, that's a static instance variable or a class variable, meaning no matter how many student objects you make, they share one copy of the university name. And let's say that another thing that we want our program to do is if we ever create a new student, we want to automatically generate a student ID. And so what we can do is we can create another class variable. We'll call it next ID. We'll start it at 1, and this will almost act like an auto-incremented number, so that every time we create a new student, we'll assign this to the student ID, add 1 to it, and store it back to the class variable. And there's only one of these that all the student objects will share, and so this can be used as our student ID for every object, and we just keep incrementing it. Let's go ahead and create the constructor for this class. Now this constructor for the student class says, besides receiving its own object, it'll receive the first name and the last name parameter. And we'll go ahead and use those parameters, and we're going to store those parameters to the student object. So these actually become instance variables. We say take that parameter, store it to the instance variable, take that parameter, store it to the instance variable. The next thing we want to do is we have a student ID instance variable. And so we said, go to the student class and access the class variable nextID and take whatever value it has and assign it to the student ID. So for the first object we create, the student ID will be 1. Somehow, though, we need to make sure that that number keeps getting incremented. Easy to do, because all you have to do is access the class, go to the class variable, and add 1 to it. And so after we make the first object, we store 1 as the student ID. Then we store a 2 to class variable next ID. So the next object gets created will have a 2. The next a 3, a 4, a 5, and so forth. So this is a way that we're now more or less simulating or aping a auto-incremented value in a class. And we did it with the class variable that every object shares. The next thing that we want to do is this class will actually have a course attribute. Now this course is going to be a course object someday. Currently, no object. And that's because the way we're going to design this is we want the course object to actually be created in the program itself. And then the last instance variable is the total number of credits. And this is the total number of credits the student earns for all the schooling that they do. And we'll just initialize to the 0. So this is the constructor for the student class. One thing I want this program to do, though, is I also want to have a method that displays the information for the student if ever called. And so what we're going to do is if you ever call the getInfo method, we receive the object itself, and then we do a student stringed with the student ID, the first name, the last name, total credits are, and then we display the total credits. This is all information from the student class. Those are all the attributes. So that's our student class, and we're going to use that to create students in our program. Now the next class that we want to create is the course class. And we said that a course will actually have certain attributes. But the one thing you need to realize is the student class will have a course object someday stored in it. But we're not forcing that to happen right now, so we sort of have a weak association with it, sort of like an aggregated association then, because we're saying that the course object could live by itself if we wanted it to. For this constructor, what we want to do is we want to receive the object, the course number, title, credits, and then look what we're going to receive, the student owner object. And that's because we can use this object and pass it anywhere else, and now we have access to all of these instance variables and method because we have a reference back to that object. It provides a pathway to get to the object above us. So let's go ahead and do this. In this program or this constructor, we want to go ahead and take those parameters and we want to assign them to the instance variables. So we're going to take the course number, assign it to course num, title to the title attribute, credits to the credit attributes, and then we have another attribute that we're just going to initialize to false because nobody passes the course until they're done. Now here's the other object we still have, and that's going to be the student object, the one that's really going to hold the course object. What we said earlier, though, when I was talking, was that the course object is going to own, in a composite relationship, a final exam object. So here's our final exam attribute, and we are going to assign a final exam object to it, and we're going to pass that student owner object. So we're passing the object that owns the course to the final exam. Why? Because we want that final exam to be able to access course's owner. So let's go create that final exam class. And here's the final exam class. And of course, we want to create our constructor. So there's our constructor. This constructor receives who? The course owner and the student owner. Really? Yeah, look, who did I pass? I passed 2 parameters to the constructor. I said pass self. Who is self? That's the course object. Pass student owner. Who's that? That's the student object that holds the course object. So really, this object, final exam, is going to have access to the course object and to the student object. So it more or less can do anything with those classes. Next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and let's initialize a course's instance variables. And here are the course instance variables. It's going to be the date time, the location, and the score. Now, since we're going to actually work with date times in this class, we need to make sure we go and import date time. So let's come back up to the very top and let's import the date time module from the date time. And we have to do this, otherwise, if you just said import date time, you'd still have to clarify a lot of your date time methods by saying date time dot or date time dot date time dot. In this case, by saying from date time import date time, you're going to have direct access to those date time methods. And we'll see that being used a little bit later. Now, the last thing we want to do back in this final exam, remember we received the course owner and received the student owner. So let's go ahead and assign those two objects, the course owner or the course object and the student object, as attributes to the final exam object. Now, when you create a final exam object, it actually has a reference to the course object and the student object, meaning you can now access any of those course attributes, you can access any of those student attributes, and you can access the student method if you wanted to. The reason we want to do this is because we want the final exam object to be able to update the total credits for the student object. But since we'd have to go through course to get to student, this is a simpler way just by passing them as instance variables. That object now has a reference. Now, the other thing I want to do in here, and we're doing this just for fun, we don't have to, but I'm going to write a setter method. A setter method says it's a method that actually sets values for attributes. You don't have to do this because we could always just say the final exam object dot test date time is this, the test location is this. That's what you've been doing so far. That whenever you've created an object like this, we'll say, oh, final exam equals final exam, and you pass parameters to it, and you'd spell it correctly. Then you'd say, oh, final exam dot test location equals something. Well, I want you to get used to the idea of setter methods and getter methods, because when we start using scope, meaning where instance variables can be seen, you might only really be able to update instance variables through a method because they might be encapsulated or hidden from other source code, because we're going to be able to specify scope and say something like some parameter, some instance variable is private or only visible in the class, so you couldn't be able to access it outside of the class. So here's our little setter method. Now what we're going to do on that setter method, and let me just paste in this code and then I'll explain it to you. We're going to go ahead and update those three instance variables for the final exam object. We're going to take the date time, store it to date time, location, store it to location, and take a look at this one. We're going to say access self. Who's self? That's the final exam object. Go call a method called pass course and send it the test score that it received. And whatever it returns, we want to assign the pass course attribute for the course owner object for self. Now, who's the course owner? That was the object right here that we assigned to the final exam. Passed course is an attribute in the course object. So this statement is going to say, access the final exam object. Go to the course owner instance variable, which actually owns the course object. Access the passed course instance variable for that course object and change it to be that value. Now here's what I want to do for that method. What we're doing for the method of pass course is we're saying that pass course is going to receive the test score, right? Here's the test score that went to the set test. And then set test passed that test score to this method. And we could have just written this inside of self-test. I just wanted to see that you can have multiple methods in a class, but it receives test score, passes test score to this method. This then takes that value, assigns it to the final exam's test score attribute, and then says the following. If the test score that you just received is greater than or equal to 75, then go to the final exam object, go to the student object stored in the final exam object, and access the total credits. Remember, total credits is part of the student object. So the only way to get to that attribute is somehow you have to access the student object. Well, how can you do that? It's so far away we can't get to it. Well, we can get to it because we passed student object and the course object as parameters to the final exam object and then stored them as attributes. And since you stored the course object and the student object as attributes for the final exam object, you now have access to their instance variables. So if the test score is greater than or equal to 75, then let's go update that test score. I'll drop this to the next line so you can see it on one screen. By adding the test credits plus the course credits. This came from the course object. This came from the student object. And I'm actually storing it back to the student object. And then I can return a true, meaning they passed the course. Otherwise, I return a false, meaning they didn't pass the course, and I assign that true or false to the course object's pass course. Is this making sense? You can store owner objects as parameters or instance variables in child objects as long as they're passed, and then you store them as an instance variable. Let's go ahead and save that so far. So that's the structure of our classes. That's the structure that we have where we can pass owner objects and store them as attributes in a child object 3 levels away. Student, course, final exam. And final exam has access to the course and the owner now because you passed them as parameters when you created the object. All that we have left to do now is write the main program. Now, I'm going to make this a little bit different from the program in the manual. If you go read the book, you'll see that I'm using a for loop and I prompt for how many students. In this video, we're just going to do one student. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get the first name and the last name. I get those as variables, and then I go and create a new object by calling the student constructor. And I pass those as parameters, so a student object gets assigned to the OStudent instance variable. Now let's go gather the information for the course object that we're going to make someday. So here we are, we say, go get the course number, go get the description, and get the number of credits for the course. Now we haven't made a course object yet. That's what we're doing on this line. We say for the student object, access the course instance variable and assign it a brand new course object. But look what I pass it. The number, the description, the credits, but who else do I pass? I pass the student object. And we're going to run this in a minute through the debugger, and you're going to see the magic that happens. And then the last thing to really do is we could go ahead and let's get the date time for the test. So we got the final exam date. And what did we do? We said, let's go get the final exam date for the course title for the course attached to the student. Think about this again. Attribute in an object, which is an attribute within an object. The course title in the course object in the student object. And then this specifies that we want them to enter it in as month/day/year. We gather the data, which is a string, turn it into a date, and strip the time off of it. That's why we needed that import. Then we go and grab the location and the final exam score. These are just three variables. We've done nothing really with the object yet. But if you remember, the object was already created. How do I know that? Because right here, when I created the course object, it received the student and it said, go make a final exam object and pass the course object and the student object to it. So that final exam object already lives inside the course and the course lives inside the student. So the last thing we just need to do is take those three values, call the set test method in the final exam object, which is stored as an attribute in the course object, which is stored as an attribute in the student object. Let me say that again. Go call the set test method, which is a method in the final exam object, which is really an attribute of the course object, which is really an attribute of the student object. So now we've loaded up all the data for the student, and the only thing left to do is go print off the information for the student. Now, let me save this, and let's run this through the debugger and actually see what happens. Now, one thing you need to do, though, before you run this, is remember, I went and actually dropped a line down just so you could see it. So if you come back up to this line, I should have looked carefully, but if you notice I had a red line. Remember, I just dropped this down. I said, let me drop it down. I could put it on the same line again. I could bring it all the way back up here so it's all on one line. I wanted you to see it. So what I could have done is I could have just done a backslash and carried it down. So make sure if you want to do a line continuation, you use that backslash. Otherwise, you have to keep it on the same line. So now that I've done that and I've left it on the line continuation, now I want to use a debugger. And so I set a little breakpoint here. You just click over on this line where we create the student object, set a breakpoint, and then we want to actually access the debugger. Remember this icon right here, run? You learned that in a previous chapter. Click run. Now, if this says launch Chrome against localhost, you want to actually choose Python current file. Now, if that is not there, you want to do an add config, and hopefully you see your workspace down here. And then it brings up this window, and then you go choose Python file, debug the currently active file. But once you do that, that's just JSON. Close that. You're still in your program here. Come back over to this drop down, and then you should be able to choose Python current file or whichever one that you just selected. If I choose Python current file, now I have my debugger ready to run. This is going to run and it will stop before it creates the student object. Let's click on this little run arrow. It starts the program down in a terminal window. Enter the student name, John. The last name, Doe. It's now waiting to execute this object. There's the first name. There's the last name. This down arrow, the step into F11, I use it all the time. Click step into, because what that does is it's going to go to the very next line. Well, what line do you think that is? That's going to be the constructor for student. And here we are. John went into that parameter, Doe went into that parameter. Assign that parameter to that attribute. Step into, step into. Look at the next ID. It's currently 1. Step into. We now assigned 1. Now we want to update the next ID. It's now 2. We don't store anything in course. We store a null or none, and we store a 0 to total credits. And I just keep clicking that down arrow. Now the object is created, and there it is. If I put my cursor on O student, I see the object. If I look over here under variables, there's the student object. There's the instance variables associated with it. And I just click on those arrows. Okay, let's do a F11, step into. Now it's saying, what's the course number? Well, I know these next things work, so I'm going to click another breakpoint on 60 and just click the run. After I type something in here, we'll run it. So a course number, we'll say it's 101. Enter. Just click the blue arrow and it will keep going until it hits the next breakpoint. Intro to programming, enter. Number of credits, 3, enter. Now we're ready to call the course constructor. And we're going to pass it the course number, the course description, the credits, and who else? The student object. Look, there's our student object. See the attributes? First name, last name, next ID, student ID. Remember, next ID is the class variable, and you still see it. So this is now going to be passed to the course constructor. Step into. We go to the course constructor. We assign the instance variables. And now we're going to call the final exam constructor. And we're going to pass the course object and the student object. Step into. We drop to the final exam constructor. Step into, step into, step into. Now assign course owner, which is the course object, to the course owner attribute. Assign the student object to the student attribute. Step into. Step into, we're back to the program, and now we assign that object. Right now it's nothing. We assign that newly created course object, which has, step into, look right here, OStudent has a course object. The course object has those instance variables, and one of the instance variables is final exam object. Well, the final exam object has a course object and a student object. So that's how it gets back. Let's drop over here to line 67, set a breakpoint, click the blue arrow, run. And we drop down here, what is the date? We'll say it was 10/01/2020. Location, School Testing Center. What's the score? Remember, if they scored 75 or better, then we take the number of credits and add it to the student credits. We'll say they got a 78. Enter. Now we're going to pass the test date, the location, and the score to this method for the final exam object, for the course object, for the student object. I know it seems crazy, but the more you practice and watch this in the debugger, it'll make more sense. Do a step into. We're now inside set test. There's the date, location, and the score. Step, step. Now let's call this method for the final exam object, passing the score. We drop into here, we check the score, yes. Now we say take the total number of credits for the student object attached to the final exam object, currently 0. And let's add it to the number of credits for the course object attached to the final exam object and store that sum back to the total number of credits for the student object we attach to the final exam object. Step, step. We assign it to this attribute, the return value, step, and now we make it all happen, step. If you go take a look at OStudent, OStudent has those attributes. One of the attributes is a course object. The course object has those attributes. One of those attributes is a final exam object. The final exam object has those attributes. Two of those attributes are different objects, one of type course and one of type student. And this is a way that an object can access the owner. I'll go ahead and click blue. You'll see the output. And that's how you can pass objects as parameters and store them in instance variables so that a class that's nested different levels deep can access classes or objects above it.